Welcome to another video lecture in the Pre-Minor course on leadership. In this video lecture, we will talk about leading change and innovation and discuss chapter 5 of the book. Earlier in this course, we have defined leadership as an ability to influence a group towards the achievement of goals. We have addressed leadership at the individual, dyadic, and group level. And in this video lecture, when we talk about leading change and innovation, we talk about leadership at the organizational level. So changes at the organizational level. This is what this video lecture will be about. So this is chapter 5 of the book, and in this video lecture I will discuss the following 3 topics. We will go over different types of change, we will go over the change process, and finally we will discuss employees' resistance to change and of course how leaders should deal with those. So first of all, it's important to understand that change is something that's very common actually in organizations. Here are a few quotes to illustrate this point. So the first quote is, change represents the sole constant in today's organizations. And the most important competency for HR managers is the ability to manage change. So change is indeed a very common thing in organizations, and very important quality for successful leaders is to be able to manage such changes. So let me illustrate the importance of leaders' abilities to effectively manage change by showing you some failures of changes in organizations. So here are 3 examples. The story of Seva, the actually closer to home VU IT crisis that we had here a couple of years ago, and finally a classic examples of Kodak's failure to initiate changes. I'm not going to discuss them in full detail here, but here you can click the links to understand more specifics about these examples. For now, it's important to understand that for all of these organizations, they made big failures when changing something within the organizations, or in Kodak's case, failing to make such a change. As I said, in this video lecture, we will talk about different types of change. What we can identify is that leaders can either focus on changing employees' attitudes or on changing employees' roles. It's important to distinguish between these 2 types of change, because if leaders want to change attitudes of their employees, they need some kind of charismatic leadership. They need some kind of vision. They need team building. But if they want to change the roles of employees, they need role structures. They need different workflows. They need to redesign the job. Another type of change is a technology change. So the example before that I hope you have now read about a bit more in detail is oftentimes, of course, there are IT changes. So this is a particular example of a technology change that we often also see in organizations. Also here it's very important that the leaders make sure that they address this efficiently. A third type of change is competitive strategy. So the organization itself might need to change. So this is the example before when we saw with Kodak, who did very poorly with regards to this competitive strategy. When we talked about strategic leadership, we also addressed this competitive strategy as well. So here we're talking about entering new markets, deciding to sell new products, reducing price, etc. Leaders can change either economics or people. So economic changes are about becoming more efficient, cost reduction programs, while changing people is investing more in the human capital of organizations. So also here with strategic leadership, when we discussed the example of Home Depot in the US, we saw that the CEO was focused very much on making economic changes, but therefore forgot how that would also change the people, the human capital of the organization. So when leaders thinking about change and innovation, they can either think about changing the economics or the people, but it's also very important to understand that if you change the one, you'll likely also change the other. Finally, we can think about and make a distinction between developmental, transitional, and transformational changes. So developmental changes are not very big changes, but they are more like improving something, improving a skill, improving a process, improving a method. So this is often done with trainings. Transitional is where you abandon an old way of working and start doing it a little bit differently. While transformational is very much the biggest change. So this is a very dramatic shift in the overall vision, system, strategy, and structure of the organization. So these are different types of changes, but especially with developmental, transitional, transformational, also different degree of changes, with transformational change being the most radical type of change, and therefore also, most importantly, needing to be addressed by leaders. So let's look a little bit more closely at how leaders can change these, or how leaders could lead these change processes, because this is the second topic that I would like to address in this video lecture, and that is the change process. And when we talk about change process, it's very important to name one of the most impactful change theories, which is the force field model. And the force field model is already an old change process, was described by Levine in 1951. And the force field model identifies 3 phases of a change. The first stage of a change is the unfreeze phase. This is where the organizations, the employees, begin preparing for the change. Here they realize that the old way of doing stuff is not so great. Maybe some crisis occurs, something threatening happens, and they see the need to change things. And therefore, they start to acknowledge that it's important to make a change. Then in the second phase, the actual change happens. They implement the change. They look for new ways of doing things. Finally, in the third phase, they refreeze. The change becomes the new normal. The change is embedded within the organization. Now, the most important thing to realize and understand when you look at this force field model is that you need all 3 phases of a change in order for a change to be successful. That's the claim that was made. This is, for instance, clearly illustrated. If you would skip the unfreeze phase, so the first phase of the change process, the employees working in the organizations don't see the importance of the change. So you would just implement the change, and then the change becomes a new normal without making sure that the employees are well aware of why it is actually important and acknowledge the importance of the change process will not be successful. So leaders have to be very sure that they engage and make sure that all 3 phases, that all employees, the full organizations, goes through all 3 stages of the phase of the change process. And therefore also the leader has a key role in making sure that all employees acknowledge the importance of the change. They need to see the value. So there's 2 ways in which the leader could do this. The leader could, on the one hand, focus on the forces for change, the so-called driving forces. So the leader can increase these kind of driving forces, increase incentives, use their precision power, for instance, to force the change. The second thing that the leader could do is focus on the forces related to resistance of change, restraining forces. So the other thing that a leader could do is reduce these restraining forces. Why do people do not like the change, and try to get rid of those? For instance, reducing the fear of a failure or economic loss. So there's 2 things in which leaders can move a change forward and implement this change process by either increasing the driving forces or by decreasing the restraining forces. Now, if we're talking about the critical role that leaders have in a change process, it's also important to realize that there are different stages that people go to, that employees go to, when they find themselves in a change. So when an organization decides to implement a change, the change curve by Kubler and Ross suggests that these employees go through different stages. They go from shock to denial, to anger, to depressions, to acceptance, to integration of the change. And as a leader, if you want to motivate and influence your employees, The most important thing to realize here is that the leaders need to be aware of the states in which the employees find themselves. So if the employees is in the shock phase, they probably need a very different types of leadership compared to when they're in their anger, depression, or acceptance phase. So the leader needs to acknowledge these different phases and needs to be on the lookout for where their employees find themselves. By doing so, they can reduce the resistance to change. And this is the last topic that I would like to highlight. In order for leaders to reduce the resistance to change, they need to be cautious of the following. As I explained earlier, they need to make sure that the employees understand the necessity of the change, the importance of the change. Why do we need to change in the first place? This is a key thing that leaders need to do for a change to be successful. This is, as we have seen, the first unfreeze states of the model. Leaders also need to make sure that the change is feasible and also perceived as being feasible, so it cannot be too radical. They need to illustrate the effectiveness of the change, but also understand that there are certain personal losses of change. So some people might lose something and they need to acknowledge this. Change, if a change is inconsistent with the values of the organizations, it's very likely to fail. Finally, we have talked about the importance of trust before. Employees need to trust their leaders. We have seen how important that is before, for instance, talking about transformational leadership. And here, when we're talking about changes and initiatives, we have seen that if leaders are not trusted, the resistance to change will increase, which likely makes it that the change initiative will not be successful. Therefore, trust is a critical aspect in making change successful in organizations. Overall, this leads us to the following key takeaways of this lecture on leading change and innovation. We have seen, and I hope by now you have looked at in more details as the examples of these as well, is that organizational change initiative often fails. And we have seen that leaders can play a key role in whether a change initiative is successful or not. And they can be more successful if they understand the different types of change and the change process.